exploring the multiverse of pop culture.
This is Podcasserole.
An Adam and JP show.
Welcome to Podcasserole.
Hi there.
I am J. Patrick. That is Adam. It's been a sad week. Let's just be honest. For our culture.
Man, yeah, this is a rough one.
We lost like one of our founding fathers.
And it shows you how far he reaches. We're talking about Stan Lee, by the way. When people on your Facebook that you haven't spoken to in years, you would think would have no clue who that even would be. That they have posts on the Facebook about R.I.P. Stan Lee. People 15 years ago that may or may not have made fun of me for liking comics. I'm not bitter.
Yeah. Or you could be Armie Hammer.
Right. Yeah, what happened with that?
So here's the tweet that Armie Hammer, the Lone Ranger.
The almost wannabe Batman.
Almost Batman.
Yeah.
And that was Justice League Dark with Guillermo del Toro.
It was right after Nolan's whole universe wrapped up. And yeah.
Or was he going to be Superman?
I know Batman for sure.
He was Batman.
Yeah.
You're right. So Armie Hammer sees all these photos going on social media of people hanging with Stan Lee. And then he tweets this out. Let me see if I can find... No better way to commemorate an absolute legend than putting up a picture of yourself, he wrote. Did you see Jeffrey Dean Morgan's response?
I did not.
Jeffrey Dean Morgan, Negan from Walking Dead,
Yeah.
Bruce Wayne's dad from
Right.
Batman v Superman,
The comedian.
This is what he wrote. It looked like you found a new ways to use others' ways of mourning and their memories to draw some attention to yourself. You sound like a real asshat.
Wow.
Armie Hammer has since gone on Twitter and thanked Jeffrey Dean Morgan for calling him out and apologized for his tweet.
Wow.
So,
Armie Hammer's one guy that doesn't stand out to me whatsoever.
he sounds like a product.
He could really walk into this room right now and I have no idea who he is. Really, he doesn't stand out. There's no feature that stands out to me.
My scalp is real itchy. You know what would help that?
What's that?
Armie Hammer.
Some Armie Hammer?
We've got a special guest that's going to come on, and we're going to talk about Stan Lee.
Very excited.
Our buddy Mike D, who's been on the show before, talking Halloween stuff. I got to say that probably in my lifetime, one of the first huge truly comic book fans. In my 20s, I knew 4 or 5, and Mike was one of those.
Yeah.
Who just, Superman's his guy, and Stan Lee is his guy. And he has met Stan Lee on numerous occasions, which I'm sure we will discuss. So we're going to get Mike D on the
Superman
phone.
is his guy? I think he said Superman is
I thought he said Spider-Man.
I think I heard Super. Either way,
Superman's my guy.
Yeah, Spider-Man's his guy.
Spider-Man's his guy. Maybe I did say, I'm staring at a picture of Superman. So Mike's going to come on, and we're going to talk about Stan Lee.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to discuss about Stan before we get to Mike?
I mean, not that we didn't say in the interview.
Yeah.
Or the talk.
Okay, spoiler, we've already recorded.
Yeah, oops, yeah. Nothing that we will say in the talk later on. But yeah, I mean, he's pretty important. I think we spoke about it, but didn't really say it in words. But I think, and this may be overdoing it, but in my opinion, the fact that physical comics and comic shops are still around today are because of Stan Lee. Because the characters he created, even though through the ups and downs of actual comic sales, the fact that we have a strong Marvel Cinematic Universe and a healthy or not so healthy competition with DC movies as well, I think that's a direct relation to the actual current sales of comics where they are. And I think that's why they're still around. I think without Stan Lee, comics would not exist right now. I'll say it. In 2018.
The popularity of comics and comic collecting coming up through the late 60s, 70s, into the 80s, and, hitting a peak in the 90s. The typical fan of comics, I don't want to use the word outcast, but a lot of times we're finding it hard to find themselves among their peer group or in society, and found an outlet through comics. And I think that's why Stan Lee became so highly regarded, because in that sea of weirdness and not being sure of yourself, I think Stan Lee kind of became this shining lighthouse that you could be attracted to. You could find this is my guy. This is my spokesperson.
Your beacon, yeah.
My beacon. This guy gets me, and I think that's why he became so popular, because that, and the fact that, and we get into this too, talking to Mike. Stan Lee loved being Stan Lee, and put himself out there as, I'm Stan Lee. I'm the comics guy especially the last couple of decades, the last 20 years or so, and just made himself accessible to whoever wanted to celebrate that culture with him. Either it be chance meetings or meeting him at conventions. There are so many convention photos and some pretty funny Stan Lee convention photos too. My favorite was the guy in the Spider-Man suit that started going around a few years ago.
Yeah.
But that was Stan, like I love this guy so much. You know what? I'm probably shouldn't dress up as Spider-Man, but I'm going to for this picture with Stan Lee. So yeah, he was like everybody's uncle or grandfather and I don't know. There's always, was Stan Lee really like the Stan Lee that we knew? Probably not exactly, but I'd like to think there was definitely some of it in there that came out in his interaction with people and his writing, and because he always wrote up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of times to get real emo, and you see a lot of emo writing in comics, but you don't see that with Stan. Even though there may be real life, and there may be tragedy, and there may be trauma, but there's always a sense of a light at the end of the tunnel, or things can get better, or I'm gonna, let's take Peter Parker for instance. Peter Parker, a lot of struggles, but there's a payoff because in his core, Peter Parker's a good guy. Mm-hmm. So things are always going to, maybe not always, but things will work out for the good guy. And I think that's what we learn from Stan. At least that's what I get from him.
Yeah.
Just be a good guy.
Exactly. That's all that matters.
Mm-hmm. Don't be dark. Don't be conflicted. Real life is going to happen to you, but at your core, stay a good person. And when you see the characters that Stan creates, you see that over and take the Hulk, for instance. The Hulk, this menacing beast, but at his core is Bruce Banner, a good guy, So we're going to jump on the phone with Mike D. We're going to continue the Stan Lee conversation. It's the Podcast Roll tribute to Stan Lee, and we'll do that
next.
Breaking news in the world of Hollywood. An American icon, comic books, has passed away. Marvel Comics co-creator Stan Lee, the brains behind Spider-Man, Black Panther, the Fantastic Four, has died. He was 95, and CNN's Stephanie Elam takes a look back at his legendary writing career.
Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the X-Men. They're among the most iconic comic book heroes in history, and they simply would not exist without Stan Lee. The visionary behind Marvel Comics lived a life almost as incredible as the characters he created.
I'm pretty proud of the fact that some of the stories that I wrote so many years ago are still being read and hopefully enjoyed by the public, and people are making motion pictures based on them and television series.
Spider-Man debuted in 1962 and became Lee's most successful comic book creation.
Spider-Man is my favorite because he's the most popular and he's known and loved worldwide.
Lee's spidey senses were tingling. Years later, in 2002, the first Spider-Man film was released and was a blockbuster hit.
As a child, I didn't really know anybody who shot webs or crawled on buildings or wore suits of armor and flew or anything like that. I just imagined them, and there they were.
He also imagined Thor, the Incredible Hulk, and the Fantastic Four. They were flawed people with extraordinary powers.
I never had any idea that these characters would last this long. In fact, I and the people I worked with who co-created them with me, the many talented artists, we just hoped that the books would sell and we'd continue to get our salary and be able to pay our rent. The movies have done so much for the characters. The movies have given the comic book characters even more prestige.
The native New Yorker was born Stanley Morgan Lieber. He had humble beginnings, but his love for comics took him much farther than he ever dreamed. He also earned a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
In a million years, I never thought, that I'd get something like this.
As his creations became larger than life on the big screen, he also kept a feverish pace, making appearances at events like Comic-Con in San Diego.
How are you? Glad to see you.
Though his life seemed charmed, it wasn't without adversity. Lee was married to his wife Joan for over 60 years, and they had 2 daughters. However, his youngest only lived for a few days. In his 80s, Lee was involved in various lawsuits against Marvel and Disney over the span of 7 years. In September 2012, he had surgery for a pacemaker and joked he was trying to become more like his Iron Man character, Tony Stark.
To me, the most important thing in the world is to keep busy. And I'm happy to say I'm lucky enough to still be busy.
The Stan Lee Foundation was also a passion project for Lee, who seemed to believe with great power comes great responsibility.
What we concentrate on is education, educating children.
Stanley!
I never would have dreamed years ago that anything like this would happen.
The king of comics, who was adored worldwide, was most proud of his family and his comic heroes. Perhaps Lee will be remembered as a legendary innovator with an uncanny ability to capture the imagination.
Excelsior!
Mike D, first of all, welcome back to the show.
Man, thanks for having me, guys.
It's been a while.
It has.
It's been a while, and with all the openings with the White House press corps, all these people keep reaching out to me to give my comments on Stan Lee, and I said, guys, I've got this reserved for podcast role.
Oh,
That's
nice.
just how it is.
I feel honored.
Well,
Honored.
It's good to be back behind I think Rush Limbaugh has the golden EIB microphone. You guys
Yeah.
have the platinum
Oh,
microphone.
wow.
It's good to be
Nice.
back behind the platinum mic.
Mike, all I ask is 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
That's not asking a lot. I mean, Sean Hannity wants 3 hours, and Podcast Roll wants 3 hours, and I've got to sleep sometime and do a little work. Other than that, man, you got it.
Nice.
Glad to do it.
Well, we have invited you here for a couple of reasons. The first is to talk about Stan Lee. And I know your personal history with the man goes back over 25 years, right?
That is true.
So what was tell us the first time you met the man known as Stan Lee.
The first time I met Stan Lee officially was at a little store that is now out of business in the Nashville, Tennessee area called Collector's World. And Stan Lee was just doing a in-store appearance. It was a different world back then because, number one, nobody had cell phones. Everybody, if you just wanted to take a picture with anybody, you had you actually had a camera. That's a foreign thing to a lot of people
Weird.
nowadays.
Yeah.
This would have been probably 1992, I'm guessing. And but the only catch was you had to buy something in the store and he would sign it. There was no price attached to that. So I know some people that I went with, they bought like the most current issue of X-Men that he had nothing to do with, but his name was attached to it because they were still doing the Stan Lee Presents, the current issue of whatever series was out there. So, in theory, he could pretty much sign anything. The really cool story about that was we were in line and it had kind of snagged at one point, and it just happened to snag when I got to him. So not only did he sign my book, but he was literally like kind of twiddling his thumbs a little bit. And we got to talk, and I can remember word for word everything he said. I remember everything I said to him. I had got him to sign an issue toward the end. I think it was like issue 90 of Amazing Spider-Man. And it really wasn't tied into any kind of major storyline. But I told him, I said, I just really enjoyed it. It was kind of a one-shot. And I'd even mentioned that even then, in the 90s, comics were starting to do big arcs. So you couldn't hardly pick up just a comic and read it. It was like issue 2 of 6 or issue 3 of 5. And, it's kind of like you had to get all these issues to even get the story. And I said, I really enjoyed this issue. I said, it was a standalone issue. And I said, I really, really liked it. And he was like, well, Mike, and he just, in that Stan Lee voice, it just immediately kicks in that, man, like, this is your childhood washing over you. This is the narrator from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. This is the narrator from the Incredible Hulk cartoon. this is your childhood just come to life right in front of you. And, he had this ability to make you feel like you were the most important guy in the room. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't, trying to move you along. He just went right into telling me about how some of the stories that they would plot for months to try to have a big impact, wouldn't, but then just a basically like a throwaway story would be ones that meant the most to the fans. And he said, he really appreciated it. He said he remembered writing it, and then he quoted a few lines from the book. So I knew he remembered it. And we just chatted for a minute, and it was a real special moment because I was at that point in high school, and just a dumb kid, and he could have just moved me along, and that would have been it. But he stopped there and he talked to me, and I don't know that I've ever met anybody that had a Stan Lee story that wasn't positive.
Right. Yeah.
And that's really rare in the world we live in today, that somebody doesn't have a story that's, well, I met him one time at the airport and he told me to get lost. I mean, you never hear that about the guy.
Especially to be the age he was at 95. I mean, I imagine myself personally after the age of 65, you don't want to talk to me. I'm just giving you a heads up.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So you said that's the first time you met him. Do you have an actual count in your head? I mean, an official number, how many times you met him throughout the years?
I've had a few people ask, and I'm going to just round it off at 10.
Wow, man, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, there were times I would not give to have been able to take a picture with him, and I'd actually had a disposable camera back then, and they were very strict on no photos. They were just trying to get people through the line, and I saw, it's kind of funny. I really haven't seen anything negative about Stan at all. There's always going to be one or two little hiccups where you've got the loyalist for Jack Kirby, and
Ditko lovers.
You kind of into that argument later, but. I saw something where somebody is talking about how he really wasn't. He was just a guy. He's just a guy that fell into something that he loved doing, and he genuinely seemed happy with being Stan Lee.
Right. Yeah.
And to give credit, I was kind of doing a little research for this episode we were going to do tonight, and I saw where Kevin Smith had made the comment. He was like, the best character that Stan Lee ever created, was Stan Lee, the character. And that's what he kind of became at one point,
Well, for the last 20 years, that's kind of been his main source of income, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Is just being Stan Lee.
Yeah.
He spent so many years building and becoming the architect for all this stuff that we enjoy so much today. And like you said, in a few minutes we can break down what characters and the true impact. But if you grew up on these Marvel movies, or if you're growing up on these Marvel movies, you may only know Stan Lee for his cameos, which goes back to technically he was in The Trial of the Incredible Hulk, which was a TV movie.
He was in Mallrats.
And he was in Mallrats,
Yeah.
But his first Marvel cameo, if I'm not mistaken, was technically X-Men in 2000.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Spider-Man. Right? Yeah. And then Spider-Man right after. Yeah.
Yes, correct. That's correct.
Yeah. He was on the beach buying a hot dog.
Yes. It has a hot dog vendor.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was such a shock. And at the time, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek, kind of a secretive, taboo thing. I mean, of a theater full of 100 people, maybe 10 people hey, that's Stan Lee. Who? And it grew from there, it's kind of cool.
Well, and the thing about it is, as we get older, I feel like Stan Lee, his, he was in World War II, which a lot of people don't know. He was, a gopher when he started in the comics industry, and he kind of built his way up to where he became. But sadly, kind of at the end, he is a celebrity at this point. He's a bigger celebrity than a lot of the celebrities that are in their own movies. Everybody's ready for the Stan Lee cameo. He's almost become the Where's Waldo of the Marvel universe. Yeah. It's like, and if Stan doesn't have a cameo, you almost feel cheated at this point. It's like, that's the first thing I heard about the Venom movie. It was like, well, what about Stan? Does Stan have a cameo on the Venom? It's like, nobody even asked if it was good or not. It was just, is Stan Lee in it,
Yeah. You talk about go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say one thing I was going to go back to when you were talking about how, being an elderly person, how tired you would get. Yeah. Jason Latour, he is the writer and the co-creator of Spider-Gwen. And I met him at Heroes Con a couple years ago and got to ask him a question. And I said, have you actually ever introduced yourself to Stan Lee, and how would he feel about you taking one of his creations and kind of turning Gwen Stacy into almost like a pseudo Spider-Man? And he told a really good story, about meeting Stan. And he, at that point in Stan's life, I don't think Stan would have really cared one way or another what was going on. He explained to Stan what they were doing, and I think after the whole story, he said Stan just looked at him and said, "Excelsior!" So you kind of don't know if he really got exactly anything from the conversation. But Jason had made a good point. He said, I do these conventions like the one I'm at today. And he said, you can be here, for 5, 6, 7 hours. And he said, I am not an older person, but I'm not a young person. And he said, but, sitting here at these tables and, for hours and hours and hours, he said, Stan being in his 90s, he said, he's just as fresh as the guy, to the guy that's 500th in line than the guy that was number 1 in line.
Right,
How do you keep that going?
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that when we I've never formally met Stan Lee, but I have been in his presence a couple of times. And the one that comes to mind is Wizard World, the first Wizard World in Nashville, which was 2013.
The first one was, yeah.
Yes.
2013. Just watching him be Stan Lee and holding a press conference on day one with Lou Ferrigno and the mayor of Nashville.
The mayor of Nashville,
and the Fonz.
And the Fonz, yeah. Henry Winkler was there.
Our good friend Adam Prince, Nashville's Dark Knight, was actually, that picture surfaced after Stan passed, and our good friend Adam Prince was there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just his stamina, it was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
He was up. He was excited to be there. He had the mental faculties were totally there, and he was fun and had a good sense of humor. And he did that. He was out for a little while, and then Stan went up to his hotel room and then came back later that night. But that seems to be the story that you hear over and over again. Is that when he had to be on, he could be on, even to the week of his wife passing away last year. And then him still making the ceremony for his handprints,
down at Mann's Chinese Theater.
Yeah, there on at Hollywood and Vine, and he was Stan Lee.
Yeah,
and it's just amazing that, and I totally agree with that statement. Is one of his best characters, if not his best character.
He
Stan
slowly
Lee.
kind of evolved into a character. Like, he was such a good huckster that, I think he could sell you anything. It just happened to be the industry he was in was comics. And, I really, when I first heard about this on Monday, it was one of those things where he was 95 years old, and was it a shock? No. But at the same time, it's like we now live in a world without Stan Lee. Like, I know they filmed several more cameo scenes, but it's just the fact that every time I met Stan Lee towards the end of the run, I always thought it would be the last time. I met him in Kentucky, and I thought, well, this is almost like this will be our last time to meet Stan. And then he came through Nashville, because there was a time where he had gotten sick and he had kind of suspended and canceled a lot of his appearances. And everybody was, oh no, this is going to be it. Stan's not going to be with us much longer. And then he would kind of pop back up and then start doing conventions. And I had a really good relationship over the years with a couple of his handlers. And one of them I'd asked one time, I said, it's just amazing that he can do this, that to be his age and to just pop up and show up and do these conventions and do these panels. And toward the end of the run, he kind of had to have somebody on stage with him to kind of almost translate. He had a hard time hearing. I know he had some hearing loss. So the guy on stage would kind of have to just recite back what the guy in the audience was asking. And, and Stan would just kind of joke about it and laugh about it. And he just seemed like such a genuinely good guy. I mean, again, you just never heard anything negative. And I always thought, when you do hear the people that would fuss about, well, Kirby did this or Ditko did all of this, Stan was quick to always give credit where credit was due. I mean, he I always heard any type of conversation when when you created this or you created that. Well, yeah, I co-created this with Jack Kirby, or Steve Ditko did this with me. I feel like he did get a lot of credit. He took a lot of credit, but he had reason to take a lot of credit.
Yeah, he was always in that regard very very duo driven, like you said. There was never a Bob Kane, Bill Finger moment with Stan Lee. There was never that moment of only he did that. We know if he created or co-created, like you said.
That's a really good analogy, because you're right.
Yeah.
Bob Kane would give Bill Finger 0. Denied it to the day he died.
Exactly, yeah. Before we get into the meat of what Stan Lee is and was, I want you to tell one more Mike D meets Stan Lee story. My personal favorite. It may have been the last time or one of the last few times. I think you brought your sons to meet him. And do you remember the story I'm talking about? What he said
I
about
do.
them? Yeah.
So it was the second to the last time.
Okay.
We were in Kentucky. And Stan's line, he was about to leave for the panel, and I had a good relationship with one of his handlers, and I said, we're gonna go to the panel, we're gonna do the photo op. I said, I just want to walk over there and just mention something to Stan, and he was gracious enough to take us over there, and it was Stan had probably been signing for an hour or two. And we got over there, and I said, Stan, I said, just wanted to stop by and say hello, and he lit up, just like somebody kind of goosed him in the side. He lit up and he goes, "Hey," he goes, "I know you." And as soon as he said that, I kind of laughed, like he probably just says that to everybody. But he kind of went along with it. And, the guy introduced us and he said, these are the guys from Nashville. They travel a lot to meet you. And he goes, I know these guys from Nashville. And he just kind of rolled with it. And I said, I know you hear a lot of stories. And I said, I know you hear a lot of people say what you meant to them, but I said, I wanted you to know, I said, when these guys were little, I said, I would actually read to them at night, and I would read, your stories. I said, I've got the Marvel Masterworks, so I would read them Spider-Man books. I said, I would read them, early Thor books. And I said, so in a lot of ways, I said, they learned to read through your writings. And he just kind of looked at me for a minute, and I thought, well, where's he going to go with this? And he was like, so what you're telling me, Mike, is I taught these kids how to read. And I looked at him because I thought, well, at this point he was 93 and he's pretty sharp to come back with something. He repeated my name. He repeated back the story. And I said, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And he said, well, I think I did a pretty good job of it. And he started talking to the boys a little bit, and he just lit up, and, we shook hands, and he had I didn't want to shake his hand too hard, because he was very frail at that point, but he was electrifying. And he just, when he said that to me and he said that to the kids, I thought, we'll always have that moment, because I know he hears that constantly, the constant accolades. Stan, you mean the world to me. Stan, we love you. Stan. And, I just thought, I think everybody has that. When you're around Stan Lee, you want to have this moment with him to say, here's what you mean to me. And a lot of people, I think celebrities especially, would brush that off because they hear that. But Stan would genuinely sit there and listen to you and feel like he got something from it. And, just like him looking up at me and saying that, it meant the world to me. I mean, he didn't brush it off. He didn't say, well, we got to go. It's been a long day. He sit there and let me tell my story, and I'll always be grateful. We were lucky to meet him one time after that.
I think Stan had a hand in raising all of us on some extent, if you're of a certain age.
Oh, yeah.
And into the stuff that we are.
Yeah, and I don't think kids now have a Stan Lee per se, like not saying that, they don't recognize the guy in the Marvel movies, but, with technology moving so fast and constant, games and constant apps and, Stan was a staple for us. Like we would read any Marvel comic we read, it would say Stan Lee presents. When we watched a lot of cartoons from the 80s, you would hear Stan Lee's voice prominently, doing the narration.
Mm-hmm. True believers.
True Believer, Excelsior, Nuff Said. There was just so many little Stanisms that kind of went with it. And I do think the world got a lot darker on Monday, this week, because it just, we are living in a now Stanless world.
But I don't know that we are, Mike, because and that's why we're talking about this tonight, because I think his influence will be felt way past us. Because I think that 100 years from now, when you look at American mythology, he will be the, I heard that he wanted to be Mark Twain. He will be Mark Twain. When American literature is studied, a century from now, Stan Lee will still be referenced and known because I think we're just so close to it and so close to the birth of what he did that we don't see the historical perspective yet. But I think future generations will see the historical significance that Stan has had not only on pop culture but on literature.
Well, that's true. I mean, you're not wrong about that at all. And I think it may sound funny to say out loud, but I think in some ways, he was bigger than Mark Twain. We were able to get audio, video that will be played and replayed for years to come. And we haven't even touched his the Stan soapboxes that he wrote in the late 60s and 70s. I mean, he was so ahead of his time on racial relations and dealing with bigotry. And one thing about the X-Men that you see constantly is, a lot of people just feel included. It was like DC, I'm not a DC guy per se, but Marvel, as we probably all covered before, these were for the most part superheroes with real problems, real people, real problems where, with Batman, you think about the problems. If you really get technical, you go, okay, well, here's a billionaire orphan. Okay, he lost his parents. It is a tragedy. He becomes Batman, but he's still a billionaire. Peter Parker is trying to pay rent every month. He's trying to afford Aunt May's medicine every month. Like I guess I just had more where I like Batman and I like Superman. I related more with stuff like Peter Parker or Matt Murdock. And I think Stan had a really good knack for actually creating the Marvel versus DC, but in a fun way. If you
the distinguished competition,
or the brand X, he would have little funny ways of doing that. And people over time, it was always, are you a Marvel or you're a DC guy? And I think Stan might have actually started that feud years ago.
Well, he did Make Mine Marvel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that even continued because I can remember when I was in school being a huge Superman fan. I was labeled the DC guy, and all my friends were Marvel. They were all X-Men and West Coast Avengers. We can sit here and go through the laundry list of characters that Stan helped create or created on his own. I think it begins with Fantastic Four, and that's definitely worth mentioning because I think him creating Fantastic Four was the first foundation for what we would get in comic continuity and also in what we see on the screen today. When you go to these Marvel movies, you're watching movies in serialized form that is basically comic continuity. But I guess my question to you is, and I know Spider-Man is your favorite. I know you're a huge Spider-Man fan. But do you think there's a Stan character that he either created or co-created that maybe hasn't seen the spotlight as much as it should?
That hasn't seen the spotlight. I would say Silver Surfer, while the name probably resonates with a lot of people, they haven't really done a lot with him. And I know that was a Kirby. And I know Stan in interviews said his two favorite characters were Spider-Man and Silver Surfer. So I would say maybe if you're putting me on the spot, I would say Silver Surfer. Now, there was a character. I don't know if do either of you know who the Sentry is?
I've heard of that.
He was
the name. Yeah.
He was a character that was supposed to be kind of retconned back into it. Like he was supposed to be a character that had an origin from like the early Marvel days, but for some reason, he had been in. I can't remember what the story was on him, but he'd kind of been away. He was basically Marvel's version of Superman. And I'm trying to remember. I think Stan Lee had a hand in creating that character for Marvel. It was kind of big.
Yeah, it was Stan and Jack Kirby did it together. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, 1967 it says here.
Well, they kind of came back and brought him to the forefront back. I think it was like a Brian Michael Bendis story. And they tried really hard to kind of push the century. And it was just it was almost like if Stan Lee was writing Superman, because that's kind of what it was. It didn't really take off. I mean, I think he had a strong run for maybe 2 or 3 years. The Marvel Legends did like a figure on him. Let's see. I am seeing that he was created by Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee.
Really?
I think though that was supposed to be the story was he was supposed to be of the era of like Thor and Iron Man and the formation of the Avengers, but for whatever reason he had kind of went away. But he came back in the 2000s, and but I think that was kind of, they implied Stan Lee had something to do with him, and maybe Stan Lee even wrote a couple stories with him.
Yeah.
But I don't know enough about him. He was kind of Marvel Superman, and it just really didn't take off.
With the passing of Stan, and we know now that the impact that he's had on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he's makes the cameos in the movies. There was a time though when he and Marvel weren't so friendly with one another.
That's true too.
And that's a very interesting story, because that story actually directly affects why you see Sony Pictures doing a Venom movie that is not connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or Fox doing X-Men and Deadpool movies that aren't connected to the heroes and the storylines that you see in the Disney Marvel movies. So kind of take us through what happened. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the Cliff Notes version of what happened with Marvel. They're chugging along. You hit the 90s. There was a bit of swell in Marvel sales in the late 80s through the early 90s, but then by the mid to late 90s, they're about to go bankrupt, and that forces, and Stan Lee was part of this decision-making, that forces them to make some tough decisions, right?
That's true. I again with just kind of spur of the moment stuff. I remember, we've all heard about the speculator boom of the 90s, where you had like X-Men #1 coming out and printing like 6 or 7 variant covers and selling, was it like 5 million variants. And it's just at one point that speculator bubble busted in the late 90s.
The Liefeld days.
Yeah, exactly right. The Liefeld days. Even Spawn is starting to have a resurgence now with this Spawn movie that's in not even in talks. I mean, it's being made. But, you think about, if you find somebody with a comic collection from the 1990s, you're probably going to find, the first 5 copies of Savage Dragon, the first 20 copies of Spawn, the first 5 copies of Youngblood, and Death of Superman, Return of Superman. Man. There's just
I have so many of those you just named. So many.
There's going to be some Cable in there somewhere.
No, exactly. So
many pouches.
I know Marvel, towards the end of the 90s, eventually, I think this is where they started having trouble too. They acquired Toy Biz, and at one point, they were looking at bankruptcy. And actually, I think they filed for one of the chapters. And you had people, I think even Jim Shooter had attempted to. I know he tried to buy Marvel Comics like at one point. I don't think it was the 90s. I think it might have even been earlier. Jim Shooter, who actually went on to create like Valiant Comics. And if you like Secret Wars and the whole Black Costume saga, that was all Jim Shooter.
I didn't know that. Okay, I never knew that.
Yeah, Jim Shooter. He was the editor-in-chief. I think he was. I think Roy Thomas was after Stan Lee, and then after Roy Thomas, I think it was Jim Shooter.
I didn't know Valiant. Wow, I didn't know that. I'm a huge X-O Man of War fan. That's funny.
Oh, me too. Nice. Love X-O Man of War. But
Jim Shooter was also responsible. Like, he was there when they were doing the G.I. Joe comics and the Transformers comics, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And if you watch the Toys That Made Us on Netflix, I think they even interview him about the names of the Transformers, where Hasbro actually just dumped the toys at Marvel's front door and said, hey, come up with characters and names for all these. And so Jim Shooter was kind of like the guy at Marvel at the time that went over that. But back to your question, you were saying that about the bankruptcy. They did go into bankruptcy, and at one point, there was even a talk that James Cameron was going to make a Spider-Man movie. Oh, wow. And I saw a recent. It's really cool. I'll have to find that so you can link it over. But there is an interview with Stan Lee from like 1991. It's actually on NPR. I think it was Fresh Air. And he's talking to Terry Gross about, oh, yeah, we've got big things coming at Marvel. He calls him like Cameron. He's like, James Cameron, from the Terminator movies. He's going to do a Spider-Man movie, and it was in talks for years. And I don't know whatever happened, but it finally fell apart. And I think some of it goes back to where Marvel Comics sold the film rights to Sony Pictures for Spider-Man. They sold the rights to the X-Men. And, when you think about selling off the X-Men franchise to Fox, well, I mean, not only think about how many X characters you've got.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got Wolverine, you've got Deadpool, you've got Colossus, you've got Professor X. It goes on. And it got so bad that when they made when actually Marvel Studios came out and started doing their stuff, they couldn't even use the word mutant because mutant was a licensed character back to the X-Men. I mean, it got so convoluted about what you could do, what you could say.
Yeah, well, it changed who the bad guys were in the first Avengers movie.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It wasn't the Chitauri.
Yeah.
In the comics, it should have been the
the Kree.
The Kree. Yeah, it should have been the Kree.
Yeah.
But now the Chitauri are actually a race in the comics from the movie itself. It's kind of funny how that loops around.
Yeah, and now the Kree are coming back with Captain Marvel.
Captain Marvel,
right,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they were in Guardians too.
Did they say the name Kree?
Isn't Ronan Kree?
Yeah, but did they say Kree? Did they ever say it?
I don't know.
Let's see. Well, I don't know that they did because now
I think you're right. I don't think they ever did call him Kree.
Yeah.
I mean, but Ronan is Kree.
Yeah.
They did mention Nova and the Nova Corps. They mentioned them. But you got the whole selling off the properties, and I think Spider-Man was always the hot commodity. Even then. And then Fox did a really good job in the early 2000s with the X franchise. They did really good with that, and they were smart enough to put Stan Lee as cameos in those movies, which paved the way later for Marvel Studios to come back big with Iron Man and then all their stuff. And now you have more of a symbiotic relationship with Sony working with Marvel Studios to license back Spider-Man to Marvel Comics to put him in the Avengers movie and to do a partnership with Homecoming. So and now with Fox,
and they just bought Fox.
They bought Fox, yeah.
So now they've got Fantastic Four and the X-Men back.
That's right, and
Marvel
Silver
Studios.
Surfer.
Yeah,
I'm ready for that.
Yeah, me too.
A proper Silver Surfer.
But you know what? That's almost like a hidden blessing, I think, for Marvel because it forced them to go to characters like Iron Man, and Guardians. And
that is so true.
Captain America, who because had they had the rights when they decided to form Marvel Studios, they would have gone with an X-Men or Spider-Man first.
Yeah,
sure.
And we would not have gotten the MCU as we know it now, which means they wouldn't have gone into stories as quickly as they did, like Civil War and the Infinity War and
World War Hulk for the most part.
Oh yeah, World War Hulk. And so. And Thor, they never would have made a Thor movie, if they'd had the rights to Fantastic
People
Four.
forget that. Iron Man wasn't that big of a deal 15 years ago. No, he really wasn't.
No.
And Groot and Rocket.
Yeah.
I can remember when they were first talking about doing Guardians of the Galaxy, and that was the point. Is they were like, well, we've got Avengers, we need another team, and they were looking at doing. It was either like Defenders or we're going to do something with Guardians or possibly New Warriors was mentioned. And they wound up going, of course, Defenders ended up on Netflix, which I enjoyed that. I'm still really sad that they've canceled Luke Cage. That was my favorite of the Netflix shows. But, you're exactly right. They were forced to do something. And who would have ever thought we would be I always laugh when I hear people talk about what a big fan of Groot they were, because I'm like, well, Groot's first appearance was actually in the 60s in a Old Tales to Astonish, and it's literally just like this walking tree, and it's like Jack Kirby and Stan had a way of just coming up with these crazy names, the Menace of Groot, or the Beware of Fin Fang Foom, and it was just all these crazy names. But, they just happened to make Groot and Rocket, and they threw all these characters because they weren't the original Guardians of the Galaxy anyway. They were smart enough to pick out, kind of the best team they could go with, Yeah,
and how often did you, over the last 2 decades, have you seen those Groot comics and any of those Kirby, fantastical stories, in the dollar bin at comic shops?
Oh yeah,
and they're not there now.
No. A lot of those books, it's almost scary because if you're a comic collector like we all are, you decide one day, I'm going to sell off my run of Tales to Astonish. They're just throwaway stories, and then all of a sudden, they put Groot as a Guardian of the Galaxy, and then your comic went from a $20 comic to $5,000 copy.
Right.
So you're almost scared to get rid of anything these days because you really never know what Marvel's going to do next with some of these some of these properties. Because again, with their new streaming service starting up. They're going to need content. And I've heard, I don't know if this is rumor, if this is fact, but I've heard that they're going to do like a Falcon TV series.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Falcon, Loki.
Yeah.
Loki,
Going to be a Loki series.
Isn't Black Widow getting her own as well?
I think Black Widow's getting a movie.
Oh, really?
I think the movie's going to be for her, yeah.
Yeah.
But you've got shows like Cloak and Dagger that have popped up on Freeform. A lot of people... And I've heard the argument too. People complain. There's like, well, there's too many shows, too many networks, and I'm kind of like, well, I understand. Your dollar starts getting split because it's like, well, I want Hulu for Runaways. Okay, well, I want Netflix for the Marvel Netflix shows. I need Freeform for Cloak and Dagger. But if you didn't have all these networks, you would be getting these shows anyway. So
That's true.
It's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like we used to live in a world where. If it wasn't on the 4 networks, that was it. So now, at least we've got it's a good problem to have, I guess.
Yeah, but Mike, that's how we get classics like Knight Rider and V and Misfits of Science.
So true. So true. I'm waiting for the Stephen J. Cannell shared universe, Patrick.
Oh, I would so be in for that.
Knight Rider, Rockford Files. We need all this in one universe.
A-Team. Did he produce
Absolutely.
the original Battlestar Galactica?
I think that was Glenn J. Larson.
That
right?
was, and Glenn Larson was Knight Rider too, right?
He was Knight Rider, yeah.
Yeah.
But hey, we'll throw it in there. let's join the Glenn Larson and Stephen J. Cannell universe.
They all lived together when I was a kid.
Yeah.
They were all on the same channel.
Well, as we wrap up our stand talk, Mike, groundbreaker, trailblazer, architect, visionary. I mean, what other adjectives would you use to describe him?
Let's see. I don't know that social justice warrior would be quite the term, but maybe
he was close. He was really close.
Yeah.
He was just low key about it.
I mean, in the 60s, doing the stuff, like you said earlier, with the X-Men characters in the 60s, that was groundbreaking.
Yeah.
That really was.
Yeah.
Well, and he had a foundation called the Hands of Respect. And I don't know that he co-founded that or if that was something that he just became like the maybe like the face of. But I would follow them a lot. And whenever there was a lot of controversial issues, like the riots in Ferguson and stuff like that, Stan was always out front, and he was never scared. I thought it was interesting because everybody's got their opinion on their character. Like I think Spider-Man should be, Peter Parker, and now you've got kind of a this whole Spider-Verse, and you've got Gwen Stacy, and you've got Miles Morales, and somebody asked, it was almost like a trick question I saw at one of the red carpets. They said, "Do you think Donald Glover would make a good Spider-Man?" And he turned around, he goes, "Yeah," he goes, "He probably would," and I thought it was really good because I think they were trying to entrap him into maybe a race conversation. And, he had made the comment in an interview I saw one time where he was like, he goes, "That's the beauty of like Spider-Man." He's like, he can be, any kid. It doesn't matter what color you are. You can read Spider-Man and you can think, I could be this guy, like he doesn't have to be this. He doesn't have to be that. But his soapbox editorials all got put in a collected edition through a foundation. It's kind of like, it helps a lot of the comic book people that maybe have fallen on hard times. I think it's called the Collective Initiative, or the Comic Book Initiative, or Collection Edition Initiative. And Stan had donated, I think, all of that, and I think all the proceeds for the soapbox actually benefited like creators, because I know like Gene Colan and some of these guys that had gotten ill, they don't, back then they got paid, $20 a page or $10 a page,
Wow.
a lot of those guys didn't get the, okay, I created this character, and, if there's ever a movie made, I want a, back end deal or, stuff like that. But I will just say in closing, I want to give credit where credit's due. One of my good friends, we were talking about Stan, and he said, he's the one thing I'll say. He said he lived long enough to see the universe he helped create become the most popular thing in the world.
Yeah.
And what more can you ask for with that? I mean, the stuff that he and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and Dick Ayers and all these guys created, in the early days of Marvel, they could not imagine licensing deals and film deals and television deals and, international this. And it's just amazing what they just, what they knocked out, and it changed the world,
Enough said.
Yeah. Boom.
Excelsior.
Mic drop.
Excelsior.
Yeah. I feel almost bad saying it, and it's still kind of early, but I wish they would have clips or broadcast the actual funeral itself, or the actual event, because it will be a big thing. And sometimes celebrities, be it politicians or athletes or someone special like an icon status like that, and they kind of show that. And I'd love to see the homages given to him, like the people there and the speeches given. I think that'd be very special. And it sounds weird to hear that. Yeah, it sounds weird to say that, but I wish I could see that, and I wish I could experience that. I do.
I haven't heard any of the details on the funeral, but I would think, and this is another thing you can go back to, think about all the actors and actresses that not necessarily owe their career to Stan Lee, but you think about all the people that, his co-creations actually, gave a lot of work to these guys.
For sure.
I mean, think about all the X-Men movies they've done, all the Spider-Man movies, all the Marvel movies, and then you start getting into the TV series and stuff. And
from decades past, the name Lou Ferrigno, we wouldn't know that without Stan Lee.
Yeah.
No, you wouldn't.
It'd be a second-rate bodybuilder.
I can't say enough good about Stan Lee, and I think he's one of these guys that he made the world a better place, and he is going to be missed. But as you said earlier, Patrick, he will live forever. I mean, at some point, there's going to be a Stan Lee statue. I don't know if it'll be at Disney World or something like that, but I can see that being the next phase of Stan Lee's legacy.
Yeah, and to your point, that his fame came at a time where there is a lot documented with the man himself. Be it audio interviews like you were talking about with Fresh Air on NPR, or television appearances like Comic Book Men, or just sit down long form interviews for DVD bonus material. I mean,
Sure.
We've got a lot with Stan Lee and all the people that he touched. And and I know wasn't the first to notice this, and and it's been talked about in the ethos over the last couple of days, but so many online pictures of fans with Stan Lee. A lot from conventions, but he really did adore his fans.
I'm glad you brought that up. And before we go, I would like to bring something else up. So I heard, I did hear somebody make a crack about Stan Lee. They said, well, he loved his fans so much that he charged all this money for autographs and all these monies for pictures. I'm going to tell you, we had covered this on Collection Connection, and I think we even covered it on your show when we were talking about autograph collecting back in the day. Up until, I'd say, probably the early 2000s, you could write Stan Lee a letter and ask for an autograph, and he would sign anything you sent him, whether it be a comic, whether it be a photo. I've got a handful of things I had sent him over the years, maybe once a year, once every other year. Whenever he would do an issue that meant something to me personally, he did issue, when he did issue 600 of Amazing, he came back and he didn't do a Stan soapbox, but he just did like a little 3-page Spider-Man like backup story. And I thought, well, that's really cool. And I don't know the date on Spider-Man 600, but I mailed that to him, and he autographed it and sent it back to him. You could actually mail it to, it was back then, it was PAL, I think PAL Studios, POW. And, he would do shows, but he would also sign for free. Mm-hmm. And there was a point, and you can chalk this up to the sharks of eBay, but, it was a kind of a no-brainer at one point when, here's this guy. I remember the letter I got back years later, and it said, it was just a standard letter, and it said, Stan Lee gets hundreds and hundreds of packages and letters a week. he's just not able to accommodate everybody's request. And, as of now, we're not going to, they basically gave you a deadline. It's like the end of the month, we're not going to be able to do any more autographs through the mail. And I didn't really blame him because at that point, they put up a store and they were like, look, if you want an autograph, here's what you can buy. He will sign it, he will whatever. So then I had a guy that argued, that was talking about, well, these fans, they love Stan Lee so much. They never got him to personalize anything because they always were going to go back and sell this stuff later for a profit. Well, to answer that question, when you go to these conventions and you see Stan Lee's lines, I mean, you're looking at, way over 1,000 people at some of these shows. Now, I went to a show and I actually had my Amazing Fantasy Omnibus, which is the only 15 issues of that book. And I asked him to sign it to my family, actually to personalize it. And his handler, before I got to him, he said, well, he doesn't personalize anything anymore because it just takes that much more time to do it. And, as you can see, the line is super long. And I totally got that. And his hearing was going bad at that point. So, you're sitting there trying to spell out your last name, and I totally got where they were coming from. So it was easier for him just to throw out his name, on a book. And yeah, he charged for that, but it was kind of like, what else are you going to do at that point? He's signing stuff for free and people are immediately throwing it up on eBay and making, a profit off of it. So I never had any ill will towards Stan Lee on stuff like that.
Yeah. And a lot of, there's two ways to look at it. As well documented on this show, I'm not a huge fan of the Wizard World business model.
Right. Okay.
Or the, what's the Walking Dead one? The Walker Stalker.
Oh, Walker Stalker. Yeah.
Because I think you are dealing with, show producers and organizers who may not have the fans' interest in mind.
Yeah.
But the other way you can look at that is, and you experience this, they are bringing you someone that you really want, 30 seconds with.
Yeah.
That you're not otherwise going to have that opportunity. Now,
right.
And to counter the Stan charges, I don't think Stan sets the rate for the photo package that you can buy. That's
right.
The organizers. That's
right.
That's the show. Certainly he gets a percentage, but he was doing it for the love of the fans. I truly believe he was doing it for the love of the fans.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not like he charged the guys that stopped him at the airport to grab a picture.
No, and I personally know a couple guys. One of the guys ran into him at the airport with his handlers, and he was on his way to a show. And the guy's got a great story because he sent that to me immediately when it happened. And he said, we were at baggage claim, and he said, here comes Stan Lee with his handlers and, getting in a limo. And he was like, Stan, can I please get a photo? And he turned around and they took the picture with the guy. And, he could have easily dismissed that and said, hey, I'm going to be at Wizard World Nashville, see me there. But, I've never heard a story of Stan, refusing a fan. And I've even seen people I know not everybody's got the money to drop on a, $100 autograph or anything like that. But again, there were so many years that went by that I almost feel like if you were a comic fan and you really wanted his autograph, I mean, it was accessible. Now it did get to a point where, Stan Lee became the biggest thing ever, they're supply and demand, but I don't know. I guess when I heard people, it's like some people, if they find $999, they're mad that they didn't get 1,000.
Right.
It's like, well, here's a guy that everybody wanted to meet, and he gave you the opportunity to meet him. He came to shows, he signed autographs, he did panels. Those panels, you got to ask him. They never censored any questions. Sometimes people would get adversarial and, they'd ask questions about Jack Kirby, and he never, said anything bad about Kirby or Ditko. And I'm afraid that Jack Kirby just did not live long enough to see the creation of his work. I think if he'd have lived, he died, I think in maybe 94, 95, somewhere in there. If he would have lived like Stan Lee had lived up until this week, I think Jack Kirby would be getting all the accolades just as much as Stan.
Mm-hmm.
But Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man, he didn't want that. He never wanted that.
Yeah.
I mean, he shied away from any type of fame. There was kind of a legendary story. And I know we're going a little long on this. I hope this is okay.
No, you're good.
We had there was like a legendary story back when the Spider-Man movie came out, the first one with Tobey Maguire, that Sony had reached out to San Diego Comic-Con. They were trying to get in touch with Ditko, and they wanted him to be on board with this. And they offered Ditko, it was either like $1 million or $2 million to come to San Diego, basically just and do a couple panels and talk to fans. And he was like, no. He's like, I have no interest in Spider-Man.
Wow.
So, I mean, you're thinking this was the guy that, like, if he really wanted his story out, there was, some people say he was mad about Spider-Man. Some people say he was mad about Stan Lee, but there was never anything clear.
Yeah.
So it was like, well, here's your opportunity. Hey, even if you didn't want the money, donate it to a charity, you know?
Yeah.
But, you don't want to, people keep sticking a microphone in your face and you keep shoving it away. What else can you do, So.
And that's a real testament to how much the creators are respected now with the film companies.
Yeah.
Ditko and Kirby and Stan Lee get all the, and even Jim Starlin recently,
I was so glad to see that too.
Yeah. That they get the credit that they're due on the screen. And I think, especially in Stan's case, financially are rewarded when their characters are used by Disney. To show you how far we've come, go back to when Superman debuted in theaters in 1978, and Joe Shuster couldn't even afford a movie ticket to go see Superman the movie, and he helped create. He co-created that character.
How sad would that have been?
I know.
Like, we have come a long way. That's exactly right.
And Stan Lee was a big part of that, as being an ambassador, because not only and here's where I think Stan stands out from the other creators. Is that he became not just the ambassador for his creations, but I think Stan became the ambassador for comics in general. And even though he had fun with the whole Marvel DC thing, I have to think that he didn't actually hold any ill will towards DC.
Oh, no.
He just wanted to see the business itself get respect and it finally did. And like you said,
it really did.
It finally did, and he did live long enough to see that. Adam, do you have any final Stan Lee thoughts?
I think we've covered it.
Yeah.
I mean, we go on for hours, but for what we have tonight, I think it covers it.
Yeah.
I think so.
I saw, as we sign off, I saw where the Superman statue in Metropolis, Illinois, actually put a black armband on Superman to commemorate the passing of Stan Lee. Yeah. And I thought, that says a lot for what you just said, a DC icon property, and they're like, hey, even Superman, even the people behind the Superman statue respect Stan Lee's, dedication to comics,
Mm-hmm. Well, I've noticed, and it could be who just paid for it, but and all this week as I've drove to work, there's a video billboard that I pass, and every day since Monday, it's said Heroes of Heroes. And it looks like the Marvel font, and it's got Stan Lee, 1922 to 2018.
Wow.
And it's got a picture of him. Yeah.
Wow.
So that could be somebody paid for that, or it just could be the company that owns that, putting it up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another testament to Stan and what he's done, and how everybody knows Stan Lee. My coworkers aren't huge, comic book movie fans. They know they got the working knowledge, but they're not into this as deep as we are. And they've all come up to me this week and were like, "Oh, sorry to hear about the
yeah,
the
a
guy."
few of those, yeah.
And I was like, "You mean Stan Lee?" And yeah. And I'm like, "Oh, okay, yeah." I didn't know him, but I'm certainly aware of what he's done.
Yeah.
And even my niece sent me a text message that said, "Sorry about your loss."
Yeah.
Because even she realizes the impact that this guy has had. Not on just comic culture, but pop culture. He helped define a large segment of pop culture in the 21st
He really
century.
did.
Yeah.
You've got video game aficionados, you've got television people, movies, comics, he's larger than the medium at this point. And, DC doesn't have a Stan Lee. DC, you could say maybe Bob Kane, but he created, one guy. By the way, if you even want to say that, that's in quotations. Yeah. But you've got Schuster and Siegel with Superman, but you don't have a Stan Lee at DC that co-created so many characters. And I think, and I'll always give credit where credit's due. Without, the House of Marvel, you've got Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee.
Yeah.
And again, on their own, none of this would have happened. It was just like the perfect combination for these three guys to come together, and it turned out, the way it turned out.
Yeah, if anyone ever wants a good shock, just Google characters that Stan Lee created or co-created, and the list is astonishing. It's amazing. It's superior. It's spectacular.
Uncanny.
It's uncanny, yeah. It's a really it's an insane list of, I thought I knew the majority, but you see the full list of what he helped create, you're like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Just to have that kind of creativity and longevity, stuff ranging from the early 60s on. It's crazy, the form of work he had. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look how fast, some of those were back to back. From like 62 to 65, 66, the amount of iconic characters he was just pumping out left and right. It's crazy. The timeline's insane.
And those stories, if you go back and read them, they're like reading one book back then was like reading a 3-page or a 3-issue comic. They were just chocked full, six panels each page, and just
dialogue
sometimes
bubbles just thick.
They didn't have room for the art. It was so much writing there.
And he was chalking out, and he was cranking out 10, 12, 13 titles a month at one point?
At one point, because it was, they started with Fantastic Four and then Spider-Man and then, Thor, and then, there was a limit on what Marvel could put out because they were under DC's. I'm trying to remember how the publishing, it was something like Marvel could only put out so many books on the shelf. Mm-hmm. And then once that expired, I think in the 70s is when or maybe the late 60s, that's where you had the burst of like Iron Man and Submariner and so many of those other characters that kind of came later.
And
their own titles.
He truly helped define Marvel because when he went to work for him, they were timely. It was timely comics,
right?
And then through his work, not his work alone, but you saw it evolve into Marvel. You saw timely.
I'll tell you
what's
really fun is those Marvel Masterworks. If you go to the pre-superhero stuff of like the 50s and 60s, like the Tales to Astonish and Tales of Suspense, before they became superhero titles, they're almost like reading little like 5 to 8 page Twilight Zone episodes. They're really good. They usually have like a twist ending. They're hit or miss. Some of them are great and they're just amazing, and then some of them are just kind of fizzle out. But every time you finish a book, at the end of it, it says, "Hey, this is Stan Lee, and let us know what you thought about this yarn, and if you'd like to see more of it, write us." And even back then, they would talk about send us a dime for a button, or send us a little, a couple pennies for this. And he was just a good salesman. You think about kids at that age, sending in their nickels and dimes for these little trinkets, he was selling. But
what was it called? The Mighty Marvel Marching Brigade? Is that what it was called?
Yes, I think that the MM Mighty Marvel Marching Society.
That's it. Yeah,
that's funny.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Mike, thanks for hanging out with us tonight.
Hey,
thank you.
Thank you so much for the call. I really appreciate it. Like you, I felt like I lost a grandfather. I had so many calls and well wishers, and people just kind of checking in. And but you're right. He'll still be with us, and I'm sure we'll be talking about him in future episodes. But guys, it was really fun. Thanks for having me on, and let's do it again soon.
Well, how about next week? We'll talk about Rocky.
Yeah.
Oh,
Creed.
I love it. I love it. My second favorite thing to talk about.
So there is over an hour of us just gushing over Stan Lee.
He deserves it.
With Mike D.
He deserves it all and more.
Welcome to Stan Lee with Mike D. And I don't think there's any more we can say about that.
No, that's
well, there is, but
it's been covered.
Yeah. We can't say anything that hasn't been said already.
Right.
You can check us out online at adamandjp.com.
Of course, on Facebook.com/AdamandJP, and Twitter is always fun at AdamandJP as well.
I'm Jay Patrick. That's Adam.
Eat your podcast roll.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big bang up. Wherever there's a hang up, you'll find a Spider-Man.